unrequited love. Like it
Yes.
seems like Luca
Yes.
Guadagnino loves this almost blue ball type of narrative
Yeah.
of like
Yeah.
not fulfilling the climactic experience
Right. And,
with love.
yeah, and I think we've all experienced that, and we know how painful it is and how paralyzing it could be, and um, it's agony. He captures agony, the agony of unrequited love.
Welcome to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, an arts and culture podcast. I'm Dr. Andrew Rimby, the host and founder. Wherever you are listening, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, please do me a favor, make sure you're following the show and make sure that you rate and review us. It really means a lot, and it continues to allow me to get really exciting guests for the podcast and to continue delivering the podcast for free. Remember, though, we do have a Patreon, so if you don't want to listen to ads and you want to watch the video episodes of the podcast, patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Do you know that there is a book club? It's free and virtual. So easy to just join the book club in your pajamas on a Sunday afternoon. Our next book club is June 22nd at 5 p.m. We are reading Sophie Gilbert's Girl on Girl: How Pop Culture Turned a Generation of Women Against Themselves. She writes for The Atlantic. She is such an amazing pop culture expert. So if you've always wondered, wait, why did the paparazzi harass Britney Spears like that? Or did the Spice Girls really have a love-hate relationship with each other? You're going to want to read this book. So to join the book club, email ivorytowerboilerroom@gmail.com and I will give you the Zoom link, June 22nd, 5 p.m. Without further ado, oh, and a brief message of thanks. Thank you to Mary DiPipi, the chief contributor, and Christian Garcia, who edits this podcast, and my fiance and parents, who continue delivering really creative ideas my way. And without further ado, here's today's episode. Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Andrew Rimby. Welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. I'm so excited to be chatting and celebrating all things Pride Month, but I always am having LGBTQ conversations here as a gay scholar. So, it's always Pride Month in the
Yes.
ITBR, but especially today's all things queer themes, the queer film by Luca Guadagnino. And my guest is such an expert on film culture. I know like he's taught film before, so I'm excited to get into that with him. I'm joined with a writer, Brian Alessandro, who I actually first met through the Gay and Lesbian Review and
Mhm.
his review that he did on the film Queer, which is kind of what inspired this conversation. But he's also an
Yes.
incredible creative writer. He just came out with a novel called Julian's Debut from Rebel Satori Press, who actually I had on Scott Alexander Hess, who published under Rebel
Uh,
Satori Press, and you
that's
probably
right.
knows him.
I do. Yeah, we'll talk about that too. I have stories to tell
Yes,
you about
yes,
him.
yes. So he's also written for Newsday, Huffington Post, Lambda Literary, Kirkus Reviews. He co-adapted Edmund White's A Boy's Own Story into a graphic novel, and Edmund White is all the rage, always, but right now because of his really scandalous, salacious memoir that just came out, which maybe you
Yeah,
can get into your thoughts on that.
it's
He co
delicious.
yes, he co-edited Fever Spores, The Queer Reclamation of William S. Burroughs. So if you don't know, William S. Burroughs wrote the novel Queer. So, Brian is really close to the material
Mhm.
with Queer. And he also has a feature film called Afghan Hound, streaming on Plex, Tubi, Amazon. And his
Mhm.
first novel was called The Unmentionable Man, published in 2015 by Karn Press, I want to say.
Karen Press.
Karen Press. Okay.
Karen Press. Yeah.
And then his second novel is called Performer Non Grata by Rebel Satori Press in 2023. So, welcome to the ITBR, Brian.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you for having me.
I have to just ask, like, I know that you do have this background in teaching film. I think I've read that you got your MA at Columbia, and it's not in film, but I think it's in
No.
psychology.
Yeah, I'm a a very sort of multivariate background, I guess you could say. My master's from Columbia is in clinical psychology. I'm actually working on my doctorate right now in psychology with an emphasis on the intersection between psychoanalysis and philosophy,
Mm.
with a little bit of trauma and neuroplasticity thrown in for good measure. But I also have made a feature film, as you said before, and I did teach film for 7 years at the high school level. And I've written about film. I have two films sort of in pre-production right now with the same producer. He won an Oscar a couple of years ago. I think I can say who he is. It's Daniel Dreyfus. He won the Oscar for producing All Quiet on the Western Front, which won
Okay.
the Oscar for best international feature for Germany. Yeah.
That's exciting. Yeah. So when you were teaching film, did you feel in high school the environment that you had to really get approved the films you were going to study? Because I assume that you're not just going to say, okay, we're going to now analyze Schindler's List and then just.
Well, this is funny. So the school was is a small private school in Queens. They catered mainly to at-risk youth. So these are
Mm,
students who've had experiences with gangs, who have had criminal records, they're truant, um, they have substance abuse challenges. And so they kind of gave me carte blanche to teach whatever I wanted to teach, however I wanted to teach it, as long as the kids, sat still and were engaged. So I would teach it the same way you would teach a literary course, where we would watch a film over the course of, 3 to 5 days,
mhm,
depending on the length. And I would instruct the students to take notes while they were watching it on, the same way you would necessarily gauge a student on a reading comprehension prompt when they're reading a book. Like, who are the characters? Who's the protagonist? Who's the antagonist? What are the themes? What is the moral? What is the inciting incident, the rising action? I had them identify all these things. Then I had them tell me whether or not they liked it. And then they had to defend their opinion in an essay form. So
mm.
why did you not like it? It's fine. You don't have to like all the films I show you, but tell me why. What's wrong with it? Be critical, right? So uh, I was able to use film as a means to engage them to think and write critically. And that's what I enjoyed most about it, was to try to get their abstract brains working. But I did teach Schindler's List. That was one of the films these were high school seniors. So they were 17, 18 years old. So they can handle that kind of material. I also, I, It got a little bit hairy when I almost showed The Piano Teacher by Michael Haneke. If anybody here has seen that film, they know it deals with sadomasochism in a very frank European way, right? Michael Haneke is a German filmmaker. Isabelle Huppert was in it. She's a French actress, and it really pushed the envelope. And maybe 10 minutes into it, I kind of panicked and like said, "What am I doing? How am I showing them this?" No, and I actually stopped the film. That was the only time I had ever stopped the film. I think I'd gotten a little bit too comfortable,
Mm.
and I think that was maybe a film too far.
So would you have shown your students the film Queer?
I would have, absolutely. Yeah. I know that some of the content was a little bit graphic, but when it comes to sex and sexuality, um, my argument is, if it's good enough for the masters, if we can look at naked paintings or naked sculptures from the Renaissance or ancient Rome, why not? Um, a multimedia or a visual media portrayal of it. As long as it's contextualized and it's not done for the sake of titillation, I'm not showing pornography, right? And queer is not pornography. It's
Yeah.
art. It's art.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've never had. Oh, no, that's not true. I had on Tim Dean, who's a porn study scholar, talk
Mhm.
about teaching a class to his students. So that was like an exception. But,
Wow,
it's
that's
rare to
interesting.
find those types of courses at college anyway.
Oh, at college though. Okay. Yeah,
At
like at
college.
college
At
it's okay.
college.
Yeah, university
Yeah.
level it's fine. I think
Yeah.
that I would be okay with that.
Yeah. I think it depends too on, as long as like that's what you were hired for. And like, you're not, like,
Exactly.
I'm not going to teach my writing students, I'm not going to just show them an explicit film just for the
Right.
thrill
It'd be
of
out of
it.
context.
Yeah,
Yeah,
always
exactly. Yeah.
context.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how much have you enjoyed Luca Guadagnino's career, like before Queer came out? Were you a fan of his films?
I was. Yeah, I saw I Am Love, which came out in 2010 with Tilda Swinton, and I really loved it. And then A Bigger Splash came out, which I thought was so-so. I really loved Call Me by Your Name. I thought So I'm going to be crucified for saying this, but I thought that his Suspiria was actually superior to Dario Argento's original Suspiria. I know that's like unorthodox to say that sort of thing,
No,
but
no,
I'm
I
being intellectually
agree.
honest.
I
Yeah, I thought it
agree.
was an incredible film. It was
Oh
my
my,
favorite film of
Tilda
that year.
Swinton in it is so good. And
Right, it
yeah,
worked better.
I
I
love the
thought so too.
visuals in the new one. Much better.
Yeah, she was incredible. She was incredible. Yeah. And then, yes, yep, I agree. And more visceral. It was a more visceral film. Like you don't get a visceral the when dealing with the occult, I think it should be visceral, but we don't get that so often. But this film really did deliver on that level. Flesh and Bone, I thought was good. Challengers, I thought was fine, but I thought Queer was really his best film. And maybe I'm biased because I love William S. Burroughs so much, and I know
Mm,
that. But it would also make me probably more critical, right? Because I'm such a big fan of Burroughs. I'm such a big fan of Queer the novel. So usually when you're a purist about a writer, you tend to become defensive when there's a film adaptation. But I thought he did an exquisite job, and I wrote a rave review in the online edition of the Gay and Lesbian Review. And then Richard Schneider, the editor-in-chief of the print edition, liked it so much he republished it a couple of months later in the print edition, which was really a nice honor. And what I thought worked so well, I have friends who are also big Burroughs enthusiasts, and some of them were a little bit unhappy with how sort of emotional, or how much of his heart the Burroughs character wore on his sleeve, or how kind of like bumbling he was. But I said, this is a very humanistic portrait. It's not the kind of remote, cerebral, kind of cold, alienated Burroughs that we're used to. It's
mm,
not sort of David Cronenberg, of course, adapted Naked Lunch, and Peter Weller played a version of Burroughs that was very kind of icy and clinical and kind of distant. And I think that's the Burroughs we all know based on his persona. But I thought Guadagnino did something really interesting by making him really kind of awkward and desperate, because I think that's what loneliness and isolation does to somebody.
yeah, I thought that there was a real through line from the end of Call Me by Your Name and
Hmm.
Ilio's way of longing for Oliver,
Hmm.
and that in Queer we get that same kind of theme of, like you've said, isolation or just an unrequited love. Like it
Yes.
seems like Luca
Yes.
Guadagnino loves this almost blue ball type of narrative
Yeah.
of like
Yeah.
not fulfilling the climactic experience
Right. And,
with love.
yeah, and I think we've all experienced that, and we know how painful it is and how paralyzing it could be. And um, it's agony. He captures agony, the agony of unrequited love, and that's also Shakespeare's territory, by the way, right? So
Mm,
it's he could do worse.
yeah. Yeah, and I find it interesting that the film Queer,
Mhm.
like first, I just love your review. I thought,
Thank you.
I really love how you talk about just the addiction to love and like what's
Hmm.
going on with Lee, Daniel Craig's character for everyone
Hmm.
out there, and just this like chasing he's trying to do with younger men. Like, what did you
Yeah.
make out of this
Hmm.
search he's having for youth? Like, why is he so addicted to finding younger men instead of, like, say, finding men his age who maybe
Sure.
he could live the rest of his life with in a relationship where they kind of are looking for the same thing?
Sure. I think there's a couple of things going on there, and I think this is something that prevails throughout. Maybe not just the LGBTQI community. I think it's something that's across sexual orientations. Is that we're attracted, some of us are attracted to the younger person, especially I think if it's a same-sex relationship, because I wrote in my review that Allerton, the younger man that Lee pursues, is his junior by like 20 plus years, maybe even 30 years thereabouts. And Guadagnino did something quite brilliant by casting an actor who looks a little bit like a younger version of Daniel Craig. I think Drew Starkey does kind of look like a younger Daniel Craig. I don't want to say it's narcissistic per se. I think it's more about trying to regain the fleeting thing, which is your youth, right? Your very life. As we get older and grow into our 50s or our 60s, and we start to move, deeper into middle age and farther away from our youth, I think a kind of panic sets in and a longing sets in, and by at least you can't become literally younger, but you can possess. And I think the lover, phenomenologically speaking, the lover wants to possess the younger person because it sort of satisfies this longing, this
Mm.
anxiety, this annihilation anxiety. I think it's about mortality on some level, even. I,
Well,
I think it's, quite deep.
yeah, do you feel like the film is reflecting more on eroticism, like through a philosophical lens, like through the lens of Plato's Symposium, or is it doing something more nihilistic, like, Nietzsche-ish?
Mhm. I think that Burroughs is probably like more Nietzschean than he is any other, and there's a quality to Burroughs that is quite nihilistic, right? Um, but I think through the lens of Guadagnino, there is a kind of hope that and maybe this is why my friends finally had some trouble with the film, because they're more comfortable in the Nietzschean sort of nihilism of Burroughs than the kind of optimism of Guadagnino.
Yeah, and see, I'm more into optimistic or idealistic ways, like
Mhm.
thinking of the ideal and the what we talk about when we talk about love concepts. So
Mhm.
like maybe that's
Mhm.
why I really do like Luca Guadagnino's aesthetic. And I'm so glad, like, can you talk about Brian? You talk a lot about there's this like aesthetic appeal to queer, like even with the
Yeah.
music score,
Yeah.
even
Oh, the
yeah.
music. Gosh, yeah. I mean, my God. So it takes place in the 50s, right? Of course, in Mexico City, and it's a group of expatriates. Burroughs famously inspired so many great musicians from New Order to Nirvana to Hole, Prince,
Mm,
Tori Amos. They all attribute their love of making any kind of art to Burroughs. Patti Smith, of course, Lou Reed. So I think, even though the movie takes place in the 50s, the soundtrack is full of music. Sinead O'Connor, of music from the 80s and 90s.
mm.
Everybody I just named, right? They're all featured on the soundtrack. And I think it was because Guadagnino knew this, and he was kind of paying tribute to not just the bands who really adore him, but also I think Burroughs was so ahead of his time that you had to almost go 4 decades on to use the music 4 decades on to really capture that radical, forward-thinking, progressive sensibility. Because there's no music in the 50s that would have done his sensibility justice.
It kind of
Frank
reminds
Sinatra or
me,
Elvis Presley, that wouldn't have done it.
yeah,
Yeah.
it reminds me of what so many criticized, but I actually loved about the Great Gatsby Leonardo DiCaprio version was that they
Yeah.
used pop music like Beyonce
Hmm.
and put it to, I think, the Brian Ferry orchestra arrangements.
Yeah.
And I thought that it
That's
actually
cool.
really captured the decadence and the understanding of, like you're saying, you understand the themes looking back and doing that
Hmm.
anachronistic, like ahistorical type
Yes.
of thinking. And
Yep.
yeah, I thought it worked really
Yeah.
well. I mean, I thought that was captivating.
Yeah. I thought so too. Yeah, and you said the word. It was an anachronism just for the sake of anachronism. There was a point, there was a reason, a
Yeah,
thematic reason. So
yeah,
it worked. It wasn't gratuitous.
yeah. Was there anything in the film that you thought didn't work or like could have been explored and it just was not really fleshed out?
I, he did the Guadagnino did allude to the murder of Burroughs' wife, Joan Vollmer, a few times. Um, and it was around that time and that place, right? It was Mexico City in the 50s when he shot and killed her,
Hmm.
purportedly accidentally. They were all drunk and high, and they called it the William Tell Act, where he tried to shoot the shot glass off of her head but missed. Um, I guess I would have liked a little bit more. Um, but I thought the illusions were powerful. You know, it wasn't, he didn't address it directly, but there were visual cues, at least 4 or 5 times I noticed, that intimated that history, that very dark history, which was the tragedy that made him become a writer, by the way, in the first
Mm,
place.
mm,
Yeah. He had
yeah.
to, he had to try to extinguish the dark spirit, he said. It was like almost, writing became like a catharsis for him to get that dark spirit out of him or to
Mm.
wrestle with it.
Summer's almost here, and as a lover of literature, bookstores, libraries, the constant question I get is, Andrew, what book should I add to my summer reading list and read at the beach this summer? And I just always had a problem trying to tell people what to read. But guess what? No more. I have a magazine that has become my best friend. It is the GNLR, the Gay and Lesbian Review, a bi monthly magazine of all things LGBTQ arts and culture. Their current issue is called The First Homosexuals, and it is guest edited by Dr. Jonathan D. Katz, who is a professor at the University of Penn. He was the founding president of New York's Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art, which, if you've never been there, is a free museum. So definitely go there. It's in Soho and it's amazing. Back to the GNLR. This new edition is so exciting to read. It looks at how the term homosexuality is an invented term. It was invented by medical scientists in the late Victorian period. So I can't wait to read all of these articles, but there's articles talking about homosexuality in Japan, Russia, Canada, Paris, India, Argentina. And Jonathan D. Katz talks about his exhibition called The First Homosexuals, now on display in Chicago's Wrightwood Museum from May 2nd to July 26th. But I can't get to Chicago this summer, so I'm so happy that I get to look through the magazine and see all of the articles that Jonathan has put together with contributing writers. I'm interviewing Jonathan soon, so look out for that episode, everyone. The GNLR has given me an exclusive promo code. Write it down, everyone. It's ITBR Choice, and you get a free issue with your subscription. So, glreview.org, go to the subscribe section, ITBR Choice, you get a free issue, and I can't wait for you all to enjoy the GNLR as much as I do. Please let me know if you're reading the GNLR, and until next time when I have Jonathan D. Katz on. What does Sunset Boulevard, The Sound of Music, Vertigo, Snow White, The Wizard of Oz, and even Rebecca have in common? They've been covered on my friend Christian Garcia's podcast called That Old Gay Classic Cinema. Every time he is researching and deep diving a film with his guests, he asks the question, what's so queer about this film? You're going to love his podcast. You can listen to it on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and follow him on Instagram and TikTok at That Old Gay Classic Cinema. I hope you all enjoy it as much as I do. Something I find fascinating is that, right, William S. Burroughs' queer novel doesn't come out until 1985. Is
Yeah,
that right?
yeah, yeah. He wrote it
Uh,
in the 50s, but it wasn't published until the 80s, like 30 years later. Um, you know, there were pretty queer graphic subversive books that were still published in the 50s. I don't know why he decided to wait and sit on it. I maybe he thought that, I mean, certainly the 80s things were a lot more open than they had been in the 50s in terms of acceptance of graphic queer art and literature.
hmm. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
because in the 50s there's Gore Vidal's The City on the Pillar,
right. Yeah,
which
yeah,
I is like kind of known as the first American openly gay.
right.
Well, but there
Yeah.
is a tragic ending that I don't want to spoil for those who haven't read it. But um, I don't know. I guess I was waiting for the film Queer for something really tragic to happen, and it kind of
Mhm.
is more just like,
A whimper.
yeah, it's
It's
more just the aging body and
yeah.
the catharsis of the pain of just aging and like ending
Mhm.
your existence. It's right. It's not
Yeah.
like there's necessarily a murder or something like that.
Right.
Um,
Nothing. It doesn't have like a crescendo moment
no,
at the
no.
end.
Like I would say Call Me by Your Name actually has more dramatas in the longing than Queer does. In like the sense of there was a relationship that was
Mhm.
being built and there could have been a future possibility. Where here it just feels like Allerton is in it for, getting off for getting off sake, but you can tell that he's not invested in a relationship.
And that's what makes it sort of so difficult to watch, is you see this sort of very desperate, lonely, alienated middle-aged man pining for this
Mhm.
younger guy who's sort of playing with him and just not really reciprocating that level of intimacy or genuine affection or care. There's a few moments where there are flashes of Allerton's authenticity, and
Mhm.
it's arresting when it happens, but then in the next scene, he contracts again and it's gone, and it does feel like a loss in those moments.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like there's a lot going on in Queer.
Mhm.
Call Me by Your Name, like these age. I mean, I think Queer is more a drastic age difference, definitely than Call Me by Your
Oh
Name.
yeah, yeah.
But even like Morris by Ian Farster, which also is
Mhm.
published after his death,
Yes,
um,
that's right.
and like there's an age, social class, little age difference, but um, yeah, the age difference with queer men is definitely
Mhm.
something that is in so much of literature, like the canon of gay male novels. But Hollywood
Yeah,
doesn't usually adapt a lot of those narratives.
no, and that's why I was sort of surprised that we got queer. And I think we got it off of Guadagnino's steam.
Mm,
He had such a successful career. He was able to do whatever he wanted by this point.
yeah,
But
this.
I mean, it's a trope, but it's a trope that speaks to something very core and
Mhm.
very real.
Well, and I don't want to necessarily pit films against each other,
Mhm.
but I will. No, I'm just kidding. I do think though the film Moonlight to me was such an interesting. Like I thought Moonlight was so beautifully poetic, and
It was.
um, I feel like it's got so much recognition, and right, that was the year of the controversy of La La Land winning, but they didn't
Yeah,
win.
yeah, exactly.
Instead, it was Moonlight, which
Yeah,
was very embarrassing.
yeah.
Um, but
Poor Faye Dunaway.
I know. Do you feel though like Queer really didn't get a lot of fanfare, or maybe I just didn't
It
see it?
didn't.
But
It got totally ignored, and no shade to Honora. I love Honora. I thought it was great, but I when I ranked my list of my 30 favorite films of 2024, Honora was like 24,
mm,
and Queer was like a very firm number one. So,
well, the
but I
main
understand.
question
Yeah.
for you is where was Wicked? Because that's the one I want to know.
Wicked was number five. And I have
Okay.
to tell you about Wicked. So I saw the musical about 12 years ago, and I actually didn't like it very much. I had no real emotional reaction to it. And my husband's a huge musical theater fan, and he wanted to see Wicked, the film. And I was like, sure, I'll go. I'll go along with you. I wasn't very excited about seeing it. Andrew, I think I cried the most in that theater. I cried more than anybody else in that theater. I was a complete mess. By the end of it, my husband was like, okay, let's go. I was like, I think I need a minute. And I had to collect myself. And then I ended up seeing it like five more times.
Did you
I
cry in the Ozda ballroom when they're like touching each other's hands?
That's when it started.
Mm.
When Glinda and Elphaba started, when she made that gesture to try to help shield her from some of the bullying, that's when the ice started to crack for me. And I was like tender throughout the rest of it. And by the time Cynthia Erivo had her finale, her big beautiful crescendo moment at the end, I was just inconsolable. It was a complete mess. But I think, I think Cynthia Erivo is what made me really cry. I was so moved by her performance, her voice, her expressions. And of course Ariana Grande was tremendous. It was a much better film than I anticipated it was going to be.
Yeah, I've talked a lot about it with my students, and they were like
Mhm.
emotional during that scene. But we've talked a lot about, I've gotten them to think more about the politics of each character and
Mhm.
like how activist or how much they're weighing in on injustice. So like,
Yeah,
Alphaba's really out there, but Glinda's more of a realistic performative activist. Like I'll step in if
yeah,
it seems popular, but I'm not really that
right,
involved in the
right.
scene of politics.
And she gets caught up in the propaganda against her, which is, I think, eats her up inside. We see her wrestling with it throughout the film, her guilt for being complicit, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you feel so like what other films like maybe have you been inspired by, whether it's to write for the Gay and Lesbian Review, your own novels that you think everyone out there should add to their list of the gay canon?
Oh, well, the gay canon. Because I mean, my favorite filmmakers are Stanley Kubrick and Michael Haneke, I mentioned earlier. And well, Pier Paolo Pasolini. He was a gay filmmaker who made very queer films. He was murdered for being gay. In fact, he was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party in Italy in the 1970s, and the communists, who were the most radical group at the time on the planet, rejected him on the grounds of his homosexuality.
Mm,
So, it was like even being gay, especially at that time and in that place, Italy, which is such a violently Catholic country, aggressively Catholic, um, very religious, was even, proved too much for them back then that
mm,
they murdered him.
mm,
But yeah, my God, his films, I mean, gird yourself because they're not easy. Salo, uh, Theorema, Akatone, Mama Roma. These are some of his Porcile. They're great, great films, and they're radical. They're subversive. They're challenging. They're unapologetically queer.
yeah. He does the Canterbury Tales and the
The
Decameron.
Canterbury's Tales, the Decameron. Yeah, he's adapted a lot of classics as well.
Yeah, I think the Canterbury Tales, I remember watching it. It's NC-17.
Yeah, there are scenes I could talk about that are hilarious, but I don't know if it'd be appropriate for the podcast.
Well, I mean, we've talked about bareback sex here, so
Oh, okay.
I
Yeah.
don't think
It's
I don't think you're gonna but you're right. We'll switch,
yeah.
but
Check
if
it
we
out.
open it,
Yeah.
yes. But if we open it out from the gay canon, like what other films or filmmakers have you just been
Ye-
really inspired
Oh,
by?
guy. Well, definitely Stanley Kubrick, Clockwork Orange, The Shining, Eyes Wide Shut, Barry Lyndon, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Lolita,
Hmm.
which is based on one of my favorite novels of all time. I really love Nabokov. He's probably my favorite writer of the 20th century, Vladimir Nabokov.
Yo,
Um,
what is it about Lolita for you, Brian, that's so interesting?
I I am a big fan of anti-heroes. I'm a big fan of unlikable protagonists. I write unlikable protagonists. I've had literary agents reject my work because my protagonists were not likable enough. So I wear it as like a badge, honestly. I don't think like a protagonist has to be likable. You're not marrying the person. You're not even going to be this person's roommate. You know, you're
Yeah.
just as long as they're interesting. That's what matters. That's my criteria, basically. It starts and ends there. Are they interesting enough for me to invest 2 hours in a movie or, 2 weeks in a novel, whatever it is, however long it takes you to get through a book. Um, so I think that, Humbert Humbert was such a unlikable character and such a dangerous character. I mean, he's essentially a pedophile. But I also don't think that I think Lolita is a lot deeper than people give it credit for. It's not just about a pervy old man who pursues a teenage girl. Very much like Queer, I think it was about an aging man who suffers an existential crisis and
Mm.
is trying to recapture his youth, right? Lolita represents the young girl that he knew when he was younger, that he's trying to regain. It's almost like Proustian, really, on some level. And a big fan of Marcel Proust as well. This is like a darker Proust, you know, at least
Yeah,
to
yeah.
me.
Well,
Dave, yep.
no, no, I was just gonna say, I think it's so interesting because Lady Macbeth is like one of my favorite
Mm,
literary characters, and I think there's so much fascination, and you know, could get into a whole conversation. Maybe you have a take on it, but um, Roman Polanski's version of Macbeth is so fascinating. But
mm,
Roman Polanski brings up a lot of allegations and
apparently.
controversy, and even though his ex, not his ex, sorry, his late wife, who got murdered by one of the
Sharon Tate.
Manson cult members,
Mm,
Sharon
yeah.
Tate, so wild. Um, there's so much tragedy, but right, he stepped in it, and I'm not gonna litigate whatever happened. But like, how do you feel about even a Roman Polanski or like a director who just creates such experimental film that has so much artistic merit? Like, how do you deal with writers or filmmakers, artists who have so much controversy? Do we throw out their works, or can you separate
Well,
the work and the
yeah.
artist?
I so when we're putting together Fever Spores, the queer reclamation of William S. Burroughs, we have interviews with Debbie Harry, David Cronenberg, Tony Kushner, Fran Lebowitz, Samuel R. Delaney, and then we have a lot of essays from writers of all walks of life. We had several writers actually get offended by the project
Mm,
because of Burroughs, because of the murder, the accidental murder of his wife. Um, there are some people who think he should never have had a career because of that.
mm,
So, we experienced it firsthand, being excoriated by would-be contributors. They're like, "How dare you ask me to contribute to write an essay about this person?" Um, and I just saw this movie, Magazine Dreams, last month, which stars Jonathan Majors, who, of course, we know in the last year or two has become problematic and canceled because of spousal abuse issues. But I thought the film was exquisite, and I thought the writer and director did an incredible job. And hundreds of people work on a film, and it breaks my heart to see their work dismissed or diminished because of the actions of one person. Two things could be true at the same time. It could still be a masterpiece, and he could still be an asshole.
yeah,
Like
it's kind
it's
of like the James Franco Army Hammer type of.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Which, yeah, James Franco is back in the public eye again, so I
yeah,
guess
yeah, yeah.
his time
And
is
so
coming.
this time is
But
coming. Yeah.
yeah, no, no, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, and so is Army Hammer. It seems like he's getting work again too. He's
Oh
back.
yeah, he has a podcast, Brian.
Oh, yeah, does he? I didn't even know.
Yes,
Oh no.
called "How I Ate Your Mother." No, I'm just kidding. It's
Stop.
what his podcast. Um, but that just came to me.
That's
Again, I
good.
think you're right. I like have this conversation with my students, which is, when you never know when the tide could turn against you if you were in the public eye. So it's kind of like it doesn't mean to get rid of those works, but like put them in context. Like don't hold up these creators as heroes. Just like I don't
Exactly.
think any creator is a hero. Like we're all fallible people.
Mhm. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's the work that matters. That's what we care about. It's not the
Yeah.
person as much as the work as it is the work.
Well, and I think that actually nicely pivots into Julian's debut, which
Mhm.
I just love what you're doing here in your novel is how you create such a really not just unlikable, but just someone who is part of a family full of toxicity, dysfunction,
Mhm.
and they're all trying to like point their fingers at your protagonist Julian for
Mhm.
coming out with an article where like they all see themselves in the most ugly of light, or they're like analyzing it as if you know he's condemning them. So like what was the
Right.
premise for this? Like it feels very running with scissors, and I don't mean
Mhm.
that to say that it's a one to one because it's not at all,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
were
That's
you
a nice.
inspired by running with scissors?
Yeah, I mean, I like Augustin Burroughs a lot, and I liked Running with Scissors a lot. This was I it started with I wrote a memoir, a short memoir, for a online literary journal in 2020 during COVID, which looked at, one half of it looked at the value of passivity
Hmm.
and of meekness, and the other half of it looked at my relationships with men, my sexual, romantic, filial. So my dad, my brother, best friends from childhood, best friends in adulthood, partners, sexual partners, boyfriends, fiancés, husband, and how I've always sort of assumed a very kind of passive mode when with them. And it struck a lot of nerves in certain people. I was like, oh, writing a memoir is an interesting thing because you're writing about yourself, but invariably you're also writing about other people, the people in your orbit. And you're electing to write about yourself. That's one thing. But then writing about someone who did not volunteer to be written about is quite another. And I started wondering about the ethical implications of memoir writing and of autofiction. Then I was tasked with judging the Lambda Literary Best Memoir category in 2021, and I had to read 65 submissions in the span of 3 months. So I was
Wow.
overdosing on memoirs, and I was looking for recurring themes. And I said, look, this is really interesting. The whole science and culture of writing memoirs and sort of particularly of victimhood, in publishing, not to sound cynical, but in publishing, agents and editors do sort of get turned on by victimhood chic, I call it. The more you suffer, the more attractive you become as a writer. And so I was like, well, I would love to write a memoir, but I also don't want to be guilty of the thing that I'm criticizing. I started and stopped many times,
Hmm.
mainly because of anxiety and guilt about writing about the people in my life. So I decided to write this novel, which is on some level autofiction, really. I do kind of start with versions of my family members and friends, and then sort of twist them and exaggerate them and make them much worse than they actually are. And Julian is he's kind of an avatar of me, like the worst parts of myself,
Hmm.
really. And I think that's what fiction can do as an exercise, at least for a writer, is to kind of try to exercise the parts of yourself that you have trouble reconciling with, or the people in your life that you have misgivings about,
Hmm.
in a way that feels safe, especially if you're writing fiction, because you could say, hey, it's not me, it's Julian, or hey, that's not my brother, that's, the fictional brother in the book. But in the book, you're right. I mean, he does write a New Yorker article about his family, and he portrays them all as users and villains, um, scoundrels, and himself as kind of like either a saint or a hero or a victim. And then it becomes very successful, and his agent asks him to develop it into a full book, which means he has to then face all of these people who want to kill him, his family members, after reading what he wrote about them, and get more dirt on them so he can fill the pages and chapters of of the book. And so he also starts to make things up whole cloth.
Yeah.
He becomes a
He-
little bit of a fabulist.
yeah, he's a modern day Truman Capote.
Yeah, kind of. That's who I had in mind as a model as I was
Yeah.
putting it together.
I was recently watching Return to Oz and Nosferatu with my fiance, and I thought, wait, I just had on Broadview Press authors who wrote a vampire literature anthology and the iconic edition of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. So I said to my fiance, you know what? I need to tell everyone who's listening to ITBR that BroadviewPress.com has everything from classic novels to discussions about vampire literature, vampires in film and TV, the philosophy of sports, Native American culture, horror. There is so much on Broadview Press's website. I urge you all right now, search broadviewpress.com. You will see that not only do they have books for college instructors, which if you do teach college, you better add them to your list because it's amazing, all the resources they have. But if you have just wandered around a bookstore or a library and thought, everyone always told me to read Moby Dick, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to fully understand it. Broadviewpress.com has you covered because they have amazing notes and sources to help you dissect that Huge whale of a tail. See what I did there? I was just watching the Page Master, so there's a little Moby Dick reference. Head to broadviewpress.com, use the exclusive code they gave us, Ivory Tower, 20% off your entire order. Yes, your entire order. Enjoy your reading, and please reach out to me and let me know what you're reading from Broadview Press. I would love to share it on social media. No, I love that premise because I feel that, the public readers, we love the salacious,
Yeah.
gossipy, dramatic elements of a narrative. But like,
Mhm.
what did the author have to do to get to that point?
Right.
Like, right? Have they burned bridges in their family? And you
Mhm.
don't really always hear about that side. I mean, sometimes you'll hear about a celebrity who's distanced from their family member because incident happened or there's like pitting against family members if they're like managers.
Mhm.
But yeah, hearing it in this context with a writer, I think is really much more nuanced because, like you say, it takes a while to piece together a memoir and figure out an angle of what are you going to talk about that really has meant a lot in your life that like set maybe the dominoes rolling down, like what really,
Mhm.
because a memoir, like what did you learn, Brian, about the process of even autofiction? Like what makes a good story for a memoir?
That's the thing, you have to sort of separate yourself. If you're writing autofiction, in my case, you have to take yourself out of it for a minute and say, okay, I know these people that I'm writing about. I know them really well. Nobody else does, right? I mean, the readers I imagine who will one day pick up my book will not have known the people that I write about.
Mm.
So how can I make these people who are interesting to me interesting to a complete stranger? And so that's where the creativity comes in, and that's where you have to try to find each character's arc, each character's theme, each character's voice, and not stay so married to the idea of this is someone I know.
Mm.
You have to separate the real person from the character. And it also gives you more freedom, by the way, to write whatever you want to write if you're not actually writing about the person, but rather the character. But just very quickly, something occurred to me. You mentioned Edmund White before. Who's very good friends with Susan Sontag, and he based a character in his book Caracole on her. And she asked him, and he's very honest, and he said, "Yes, that character is based on you." She got very offended, and it ended their friendship.
Wow.
And she actually was very spiteful. She went out of her way to have her blurb removed from A Boy's Own Story. She had like publishers collect books, and it's very expensive to redo that process when you have a blurb published on a back cover of a book to reprint it. Because this was also back in the 80s, it wasn't that they were digital or print on demand. These are books that were already printed.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, that takes some uh
Yeah.
energy to be
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
aggrieved.
Yeah.
But right, I think also too sometimes like in the writing, or I talk about this with like writers who come on, is
Mhm.
the stakes are um high in the sense that there's not as many opportunities sometimes to get your work out there to the public, that there can be more manipulative tactics. But at the same time, I also think there's a real beauty in community of writers, that it's not as
Mhm.
manipulative as like the acting industry. I would say that
Right.
that's a more heightened sense. Yeah.
I think I agree with that. I do think, I was just at the Saints and Sinners Literary Festival in New Orleans 2 weeks
Oh,
ago
that
where I
looked
present.
amazing.
Oh, it was so much fun. It was on two panels, one on the difference between writing fiction and nonfiction, and one on the interview process, because I used to also write for Interview Magazine. So
Mm.
I've interviewed quite a few interesting people. And the other one was on, and then the other two were readings. So I had two public readings and two panels. And yeah, I mean, there were writers that came from all over the country. A lot of them were from New York, some were from New Orleans, some were from Texas, California, um, South America, Central America. And there was just like a real, felt like a family. There was a real sorority and fraternity, amongst these writers.
Yeah, I feel the same way when you mentioned Lambda Literary and
Mhm.
you judging, but I got to go as media to the Lambda Literary Awards that just, well, happened almost a year ago.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, the new one's
hopefully,
coming up. Yeah.
yes, yes. I think June, right?
June. Yep.
June. Okay. I was gonna say, I think it's during
You have
Pride.
time. Yeah. Yeah.
But are you going to the Rainbow Book Fair at the center?
I've gone before. Unfortunately, I have a family obligation, so I'm not able to go this year. But I went 2 years ago where I sold and discussed and read from Performa non grata, the previous novel.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
I will be at a Pride event at the center in New York in June, though, with other Rebel Satori Press writers.
Oh, good. Okay. So,
Yeah,
those of you who are in the New York City area, uh, look out for that. I am going to the Rainbow Book Fair for the first time.
it's
And
great. It's great.
yeah, I'm doing a special podcast episode. So, you
Oh,
know,
cool.
I'm going around interviewing those at like the booths.
Oh, nice.
So,
Great.
definitely, I think Rebel Satori Press is going to be there, right?
They're going to have a presence, yeah, because they have a New
Uh,
York leg. So definitely the New York writers will be there representing
oh,
um,
good. Okay.
Rebel Story Press.
But like, what has it been for you? Not to say that Julian's debut doesn't have like a strong queer narrative focus,
Mhm.
but you as a writer, Brian, and like just embodying queerness or however, gayness. I don't know how you're identifying yourself, and that's your choice. But how like has that community helped? Like, do you think that it's different being a gay writer than say if you were a straight writer in terms of the community building?
I think it's interesting. And I think it could be, if I'm being completely frank, I think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. Because on the one hand, they do want to put you in the so-called like gay ghetto, where it's like you could really only write gay works, only write gay fiction. And sometimes on the one hand, it's a wonderful opportunity because you do have fantastic publications like the Gay and Lesbian Review, publishers like Rebel Satori Press, or the Center in New York that really embrace gay voices. Um, but on the other hand, the mainstream publishing, unless you are presenting a very sort of palatable version of homosexuality, that is to say, very safe, sort of very homogenized, or even almost like heterocentralized, they won't necessarily accept you. They want to create like a patina of acceptance
Hmm.
until it becomes uncomfortable and then they reject you. So, Burroughs, for example, was trying to emerge today. I think he'd have as much trouble as he did when he did emerge back in the 50s because of the kind of gay writer he is. Um, I think on another level also you you do want to sort of start to try to we talked about this at Saints and Sinners, where if you're a gay writer, there is an attitude of, oh, he only got a leg up because he's gay, and he's part of a protected, marginalized group, and so he used his identity to get through the doors, right? But we spoke about this at the festival, and you have to almost be twice as good. You almost really have to be twice as good if you're gay. You have to be twice as good if you're trans. You have to be twice as good if you're black because you don't want to be accused of, you know, coming in by way of like a kind of affirmative action or a DE&I kind of a open door policy. You have to, at least as a gay writer, I could speak for myself, you want to be able to say, well, sure, I'm gay. Maybe it helped, but also I can write really well. So it's
Yeah.
not like anybody did me any favors just because of my identity.
Yeah, like
I think
even though
anybody,
we might get accused of a gay mafia, like there is
yeah,
no
yeah, yeah,
gay mafia that's like opening the doors for everyone. And
exactly.
yeah, well, also I think too, I was talking about this with my fiance is how much in corporate situations it's hard to find like two openly out people in like the higher up administration. Like there might be one, but then it's kind of like a
Mm,
token.
interesting.
Like the Devil Wears Prada, the Stanley Tucci character.
Token. Yep. Yep.
It's like there you go, we're good, and
Yeah,
it's almost like they're in
exactly.
competition with each other.
Check a box. Yeah.
Yeah, like if there's
Yeah.
two openly gay
Yeah.
employees, they're going to be fighting with each other, or they're going to distract
Sure.
each other, which is like just full of stereotypes. But
Sure. Yeah.
this has just been so wonderful, Brian. This went by so quick. I had such a good
I know.
time.
Yes. Thank
Um,
you.
so how can everyone out there, of course, get their hands on Julian's debut? Follow you on social media. Like, what's all the channels you're on?
Sure. So Julian's debut is available through the publisher Rebel Satori Press, excuse me. It's also sold on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Bookshop, and you could also order it at any local bookstore. And I do hope people support small and independently owned bookstores. It's important to keep them going. Um, my movie Afghan Hound is on Amazon, Plex, and Tubi. I continue to write for the Gay and Lesbian Review. I actually just reviewed Alison Bechdel's new book, Spent, which
Ooh.
will be running in the June print issue.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, glreview.org for that. Oh, and I think, Brian's on Instagram.
I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, and LinkedIn.
Okay. Okay. Great. So, thank you, Brian. And,
Thank you,
I
Andrew. It's
can't
been great.
wait to like have another conversation when there's like another uh queer film or just anything in the film literary realm that we need to talk about. The next like
I would love
gay author who gets a big Hollywood film adaptation.
it.
You're back on, Brian.
All right, sounds good. I'll mark my calendar. I'll start making lists of things coming out this year.
Yes, no,
I'll
please,
send them
and
to
then start
you.
sending them to me, and I'm gonna be like, oh, okay, this looks good. Well, thank
Absolutely.
you, Brian. This was so fun, and
Thank
bye
you,
to
Andrew.
everyone out there. Yeah,
Take care,
bye,
everybody.
Brian.
Thank you. Take care.